Growing up, I think I always wanted to go to college because I always had this urge for more education, for more learning, and it just never seemed like knowledge is ever enough for me. As I looked up Montreat College, I saw it's a Christian college, and that was the probably most decisive factor for me because growing up in Ukraine, I did not have this opportunity for learning the word. I was always a believer, but I never got to actually experience this studying of the word.
One of the things that we strive for as an institution is to form the whole person and to educate the heart as well as the mind, in the hopes that by encountering Jesus and in community here through their educational formation, that will translate into their vocational formation. So how they go off and how they serve their communities, whatever career they are in, we hope and pray that Jesus goes with them.
Montreat taught me how to put all my trust in God. I always knew God is right here, right by my side, but actually putting all your trust in God is something that takes a lot of spirit and a lot of effort. With the war that started in Ukraine, it's been very difficult for me to just fathom what is going on in my country with my family and friends. And realizing all of that was tough, but being a part of Christian community here at Montreat, having all the support here, and having this knowledge intellectually and spiritually that God is in control. Going to a Christian college in America is something that I was really whispering because it would not sound real when I really talked about it to anyone.
The Keystone Scholarship Fund is so much of the reason most of our students are here, and we couldn't do what we do without that fund.
Without your support and help, I couldn't be here, and I couldn't be at the school that I've come to love so much, and I wouldn't know the people that I know now. I wouldn't have the friendships that I have. I wouldn't be the person I am today.
I feel very grateful and blessed just to know that, there are people out there that's, have never met me, but it's like, hey, we want you to be in this best place possible. And, to me, I feel like that's the definition of a blessing.
When I think of how Montreat College is empowering me for my life as I graduate, I definitely think that, first of all, it is God having control over my life. And then second of all, I believe it is education in the field that I'm interested in and a holistic approach to education. Montreat lets me know that there are some things I might not know, but there is always an opportunity to learn it. So knowing that really inspires me. So I'm really looking forward to my future.
If you really want to make a kingdom impact as a believer, I think there's no better group of people to invest in than college students. And that's what we get to do here. And we get to really be a meaningful part of forming the next generation to lead the church and to lead our country. That's worth your investment.
Well, good evening. Let's try that again. Good evening. Good evening. Hope you're having a good time. By the decibel level in the room, it seems like you are, so I'm glad for that. My name is Paul Maurer. I serve as president of Montreat College, just finishing my 8th year at the college, and I know that there are people here at this dinner tonight that actually don't know very much about Montreat College, so I'm not going to give a background per se, but we are the last fully Christ-centered college or university in the state of North Carolina. We have clarified that Christ-centered identity over the last several years. And in some quarters, what we thought might be more challenging and even an Achilles heel has become our greatest advantage. We overtly teach the moral compass. We have strengthened our academic profile. And we've been growing. Our enrollment at the traditional undergrad level is up 72% in the last 7 years. Our adult and graduate studies program is up 50% in the last 2 years. And we think those trajectories of growth can continue. And we think they can continue because we've taken what culturally is a very unpopular stand in terms of standing on historic biblical orthodoxy on the issues of marriage and life and the view of Scripture. But we're an open enrollment community, and so we have students of faith and students that don't have faith. We welcome all of them with open arms, and we offer a rigorous academic program. You may, if you know something about the college, you may know that we've built a cybersecurity program in recent years, and I think it's fair to say that we are an emerging national leader in cybersecurity education. And some of the partnerships that we've been able to develop in Washington, D.C. are because we're a faith-based institution, because we teach overtly to moral compass. And people in cybersecurity know that trust is the currency of cybersecurity, that moral compass is required to be a cybersecurity professional, because we, like every other program in the country, teach offensive principles to our cyber students. We teach our students to steal your stuff. And everyone else does too. The problem is that most of American higher education stopped teaching the moral compass 5 or 6 decades ago. And we have continued, and we, I would argue, have actually doubled down on that. And so the partnerships that have emerged are rooted in our academic commitments to a rigorous intellectual development, as well as the development of the human soul, the development of character and the ethics that flow from that. But it's not just the cybersecurity program that's flourishing at the college. Our health sciences programs are growing rapidly, and our honors program is growing as well. And so the first speaker tonight, the one I'm going to introduce now, is Dr. Lisa Toland. And Dr. Toland leads our honors program, which didn't exist in 2012. And now we have about 90 students in the program, and what appears to be the largest incoming class of honors students for the fall of maybe another 40 or more students into the program. And when I heard Dr. Toland give a description of the honors program at Scholars Day back earlier this calendar year to the students competing for the honors scholarships, I just thought it was so compelling, I wanted you to hear it. I sat there in that room listening to her going, the Keystone Scholarship Dinner attendees need to hear this. So Lisa Toland serves as our director and chair of the college's history department. She came to Montreat from Indiana Wesleyan University in Indiana, where she served as associate director of the John Wesley Honors College. As an undergrad, Lisa had the opportunity to study abroad in Oxford, England. And that experience planted seeds, and she was encouraged to return there for her doctoral studies, which she completed at the University of Oxford. Dr. Toland's research is on the family in early modern England. She's also passionate about women's history and telling the stories of those individuals whose societal contributions have previously been unnoticed. I've asked Lisa to paint a picture of the honors program because I think you'll enjoy it. Please welcome Dr. Lisa Toland.
Good evening. What an honor to be here with all of you tonight to share what God is doing at Montreat College, and specifically in the honors program. I want to thank Dr. Maurer for the opportunity to share with you tonight. But most of all, I want to thank the Montreat students present here tonight and those back in the Cove for making our work as faculty so rich and meaningful. The Montreat College Honors Program is a community that seeks to be learned rather than to seem to be learned. This statement, which is of course medieval Christian in origin encapsulates the heart of our work together, which is to seek understanding and the wisdom of God together first, so that we can more clearly discern truth in our majors and for our lives. We pray that out of this growing discernment will come lives of faithful service for Christ and our neighbors. We are, whether we're freshmen in college or nearly retired professors, great lovers of learning, and some of the greatest delights we take together in our classes is working through difficult or seemingly obscure texts and cultural artifacts. And so in that spirit tonight, I wanted to spend a few minutes giving us a cinematic image in words that captures the heart of what I think a good Christian liberal arts education truly is. Any of you familiar with the film director, Terrence Malick, may have had the pleasure at some point of seeing his lengthy and fairly obtuse 2011 film, Tree of Life. That film begins with a blank screen and partial words from the book of Job. Where were you when I laid the earth's foundation, while the morning stars sang together and all the angels shouted for joy? Early on in the film, we're introduced to a seemingly idyllic family of Mr. and Mrs. O'Brien, who are played by Brad Pitt and Jessica Chastain, and together they raised 3 sons in 1950s Texas. Later on, Mrs. O'Brien, who is by this point portrayed as an empty nest housewife in the 1970s, is confronted by the death of her middle son, a son who had been graceful and gentle. We see her open their front door, receive a letter. She walks through the living room, and then we hear her heart-rending cry as the screen goes blank. Mrs. O'Brien's whispered voice comes across the screen as we see something like smoke. Lord, why? Where were you? Answer me. What follows is a stunning visual narration of the beginnings of the universe and the earth, a 10-minute sequence with digital renderings of the solar system's expansion from nothing to light to water to earth and soil to forests of ferns and finally to dinosaurs. The soundtrack by the Polish film composer Preisner drives this whole sequence forward, and at its height, there's a mournful, heart-rending aria, lacrimosa, or weeping. Like Job, Mrs. O'Brien has posed the question, why? I read this creation sequence that follows as a resounding divine response, as in Job 38, God responds, where were you? Malick sets all this consuming question of why against a vast scope of the cosmos. But the divine response, I don't think, is detached, nor is it disinterested. At the end of the cosmic sequence in the Tree of Life, one predatorial dinosaur stands over the cowering and injured body of another, and the audience holds its breath only for the predatorial creature to pat gently the head of the injured one and move away. Grace and love pervade creation. Forgiveness and restoration upend creatures' desires to destroy one another. The creation sequence dwarfs Mrs. O'Brien's personal pain, yes, but whenever I watch this film with my students, I also see that this grieving mother's life-shattering concerns are well within the control of a divine being who sustains and cares for our lives. So this cinematic web that plunges us into the questions of theology, philosophy, music, visual art, astronomy, physics, botany, biology, represents to me what a good Christian liberal arts honors education ought to encompass. Life is not experienced in segmented subjects in which our rationality, our convictions, our visceral feelings are divorced from one another. True understanding is found in uniting things often divided, and true understanding is found in deep humility, in which we see ourselves as mere creatures in the face of our Creator. So in the Montreat College Honors Program, we are striving to do this work of intellectual and spiritual discernment through the exploration of texts and topics. And in seeking answers, we consult biblical authorities, church authorities, disciplinary authorities. As freshmen and sophomores, students focus primarily on sharpening their basic understanding of Christian theology and the Christian story, as well as intensive English writing and literature work, and the study of world history. In English Comp, students ask the question, where am I from? In our freshman liberal arts seminar, we ask, what is education for? And together we read authors such as Aristotle, Frederick Douglass, and Wendell Berry. In freshman literary analysis, we ask, what is the human condition? And through the writings of authors like Dostoevsky and Shakespeare, we learn how literature can help us to grapple with this question of human suffering. In the sophomore year in World Civ, we consider what is the good life? And we read prison literature like that of Boethius. We meet Julian of Norwich, who survived 3 waves of the Black Death. Later in modern world history, we ask, who are you? And students consider their own loyalties and perspectives as they study the lives of others, such as persecuted Japanese Christians in the 17th century, or even when they enact a UN Security Council meeting on Venezuela's revolution. As juniors and seniors, students move into intensive interdisciplinary seminars that require them to bring their maturing understanding of their majors to complex topics like the origins of the universe or Christianity and war. We also offer single author or period seminars, including my personal favorite, Dante's Comedy, a Reformation class, Greek philosophy and mythology, and Jane Austen, who I will fiercely defend as the most piercing and truthful assessor of human nature in the modern age. In these classes, students bring their disciplinary knowledge as growing scholars of literature, biology, exercise, cybersecurity, all of our majors into the classroom. Finally, as seniors, honor students take one last class together, Faith and Life. We ask, knowing what we know now, how do we love well? Knowing what we know about humanity and the world and God's intent, what are we going to do? How will we live? Students end their time in honors at Montreat College by reading Thomas à Kempis's Imitation of Christ in 2 weeks, the 2 weeks prior to graduation, so they've just done this now. After we have learned together for 4 years and grown together as a community, we return to the crux of the matter. It is not learning that makes a man holy and just, but a virtuous life makes him pleasing to God. Thomas says, I would rather feel contrition than know how to define it. For what would it profit us to know the whole Bible by heart and the principles of all the philosophers if we live without grace and the love of God? Our honors program is not meant to be a place that puffs up those with intellectual gifting, but a community that grows together in humility and empathy and better prepares each of us to be human beings of depth and substance. Thank you for your interest in Montreat College, and thank you all so much for being here this evening.
Thank you, Lisa. And if you'd like to apply to the Montreat College Honors Program, just know that it's a rigorous process, including essays and interviews, and you may or may not get in. It's my pleasure now to introduce our keynote speaker. And a few years ago at this event, which we've held in the Western North Carolina area until this year, we went to the habit of using a TED Talk kind of format, followed by a more lengthy interview. And so our speaker will give about a 9-minute talk, and then I'll join him here on stage, and we'll have a further conversation about the topics he unpacks in his comments. It's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Sandy Shugart as our keynote speaker tonight. Sandy is a highly accomplished leader, thinker, and statesman. He's also a friend, and as far as I can tell, a really marvelous human being. Sandy served for 40 years as a leader in education, including 30 as a college president, and until last year, 21 as president of Valencia College in Orlando, Florida. He was named one of the 10 most innovative college presidents in the U.S. by the Washington Monthly. He also received the very prestigious McGraw Prize in Higher Education Innovation. Sandy was named President Emeritus in July 2021 and is now a senior fellow with the Aspen Institute, focusing on the formation of a new generation of impactful college and university presidents. Sandy is a published poet and songwriter, a touring musician, and author of Leadership in the Crucible of Work, Discovering the Interior Life of an Authentic Leader. Sandy and his wife, Jane, would you wave? Jane. Sandy and his wife, Jane, have recently purchased a home near Winston-Salem and have become permanent residents of the state of North Carolina. Please join me in welcoming Sandy Shugart.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you, Lisa. You'll see why in a minute. And thank all of you who have, with your prayers and your time and your talent and your treasure, invested in what Montreat means. And in the end of the day, of course, the college isn't its buildings. It's not its budget. It's not its books. It's not even its staff. The college is one thing. It's what the students experience. That's the only adequate definition. And that's what you invest in. And that's what I want to talk with you briefly tonight about. What is it you're investing in? What are the unique gifts, the charisms of a Christian higher education? And here I hope to reclaim the words Christian education from our church uses and understand it to be a robust, genuine higher education conceived for the further formation of young disciples in preparation for their callings in the world. What are these essential gifts? Perhaps surprisingly, it is not only, perhaps not even mainly, the development of a sound biblical theology. This is a gift of all discipleship. And you needn't attend a college or university to be a disciple. Similarly, it's not the simple discovery of and preparation for an occupation, no matter how special that occupation may be to the kingdom of God. Many kinds of institutions, most of them secular, do an exceptional job of this kind of training and induction into work, though not Christian work. And it is not an indoctrination into a particular worldview, even one that describes itself as Christian. An education cannot be an education and be pat answers to pat questions, a kind of cultural and political catechism. So what are the gifts? Gifts of an authentically Christian, authentically higher education. Well, you just heard a wonderful example. G.K. Chesterton said once that the purpose of a Christian education isn't to think Christianly, but to think in Christian categories. Meaning there's not a single way to think as a Christian, but the framing of your categories from Revelation puts you in a position to reason Christianly. To ask questions, real questions, in a universe we did not invent, about a reality that exists independently of us, that is within limits discoverable from a perspective informed by God's revelation, deep and mysterious though it may sometimes be, but also defining and leading, a perspective that requires reverence for the truth that is real, not constructed. and reverence for our limits as creatures. For all knowledge accessible to us is contingent. And the most valuable of questions, again, presuming that the fruits of discipleship are already evident, the most valuable isn't, strictly speaking, theological. Not at first, at least, but anthropological. Let me explain. Often when I meet with faculty to have conversations, in any kind of institution, secular or faithful, I'll ask something like this. I'll say, every pedagogy implies an anthropology. What's yours? This is exactly the response I always get. Silence. So I'll say something like, as a teacher, if you haven't thought deeply about what it means to be human, what it means to be a human emerging adult, what it means to be a human adult learner, and all that we know about those things, if you haven't thought that through and grounded your practice in the conclusions you draw, then you're teaching technically. That is, you're knocking off procedures and techniques that perhaps someone else developed from a grounded perspective, but you did not. Now, there's a place for technique. Just today, I took my car to have the oil changed in about 8 minutes. They followed a procedure that was well organized, and I wanted them to follow it. But had my car been misbehaving, I would not have taken it there to be diagnosed, would you? That requires a different kind of depth. Of course, this problem of the underlying anthropology doesn't just apply to teaching. Every therapy implies an anthropology. Every management system, every performance evaluation, every compensation system, every game design, every statement of ethics, every model of jurisprudence, every law implies an anthropology, for the most part, unexamined. So I ask you, brothers and sisters, discipled in the faith, in all these fields where you may work, what's your anthropology? What does it mean to be human? Who are we? How did we get here? Do we have a purpose? What do we think we know of ourselves? And therefore, how should we treat one another and expect to be treated? How should we order our lives to love God and to love our neighbors as ourselves? Our theology is a starting point, but even Christians need what I like to call a sacred anthropology, rooted in a biblical understanding of humanity, that we are creatures created, not accidental, that we are embodied, moral, responsible, transcendent, headed somewhere, deeply curious and creative, easily seduced by power and privilege, flawed to the core, and bearing the unimaginable gift of consciousness and therefore conscience. All of this can be discerned in Scripture, certainly. What an education adds to this is the witness of the whole human community to the application of God's revelation to our lived experience. The witnesses all around us, some old, some contemporary, some born in hearts and communities of faith, some nourished in other cultures. And whether hospitable or hostile, we are commanded to take every thought captive to Christ. That is, to make sense of all the reality with Christ at the center. The witness comes from John Milton and Gwendolyn Brooks, from William Shakespeare and James Baldwin, from Dostoevsky and Ocean Vuong. And it is the gift of a Christian education to learn to understand with sympathy, and ultimately to discern and judge the competing truth claims in the world, to discern and critique the anthropologies as well as the theologies that lie at their foundations, the implied anthropologies that are loose in the world we inhabit, and which we might not want to thoughtlessly proliferate. There are several that you may know. I won't go into them in depth. We'll maybe discuss that in a moment. I think of one as Homo economicus, human beings as essentially economic creatures, our value coming from what we can produce or consume. Or how about Homo determinus, once popular in the social sciences? That is, we essentially are biologically determined in every way, and our sense of volition and choice is an illusion. But the most common in our time, I'll just call Homo autonomous. Humans who own themselves, make themselves, justify themselves, brand themselves, who live in endless, desperate competition to be somebody. A promise of radical freedom that turns out to be an unbearable burden. These and other anthropologies are not easily unpacked and discerned from our theology unless we have grown in the fertile soil of God's self-revelation, a sacred anthropology. And if our faith is true, we have to judge that these competing anthropologies are all in some way subversive to the personhood God gifted us in creation, damaging to the image bearers. And they are at work in the world, in our places of work, in government, in all of our institutions, even our churches, in all the systems we've crafted without consciously examining what's the anthropology beneath us. So where do we begin the work of applying a biblical anthropology, a truth to the world in a way that yields robust, faithful, sacred respect for personhood? We start with first things. That is, first questions. The questions that precede faith and lead the earnest seeker to answers found in the heart of our relationship to the cosmos and its creator. And these are questions that the resources of a genuine Christian education can supply and help to answer. Again, what does it mean to be human? Where do we come from? Where are we headed? Do we have a purpose and a destiny? How shall we love God and our neighbor in this world and rejoice to find life in the next? Where else but in a college like Montreat? Where else will the generations of the young be invited to wrestle with these questions in the company of a whole cloud of witnesses through history and the whole company, the whole community of reverent wonder in the present? Thank you.
Please. Well, there's a lot there, and we're going to take the next half an hour or so to unpack some of these things. And so let's start with a word you used an awful lot in your comments, and that is the word questions. It's about asking not just any questions, but good questions, the right questions, deep questions. And the questions are at one level intellectual questions, but there's something much deeper there. So I'm curious, what is behind the questions that it seemed to me have also have care and love and reverence and maybe even humility that are the backdrop or the foundation of those questions?
So, in a sense, the canon, the things that we thought we taught, has been under siege for 40 years at least. And sometimes for good reasons, sometimes for other reasons, but the canon's been under siege. And the canon was vulnerable, not because it was bad, but because they forgot the questions. We were teaching sources instead of engaging people in the most powerful questions, the formative questions of a view of life and the capacity to continually make a view of life from some point of view. In this case, from one of revealed truth as the beginning point. And so, for me, Paul, the formation of a life, of a whole mind, body, and spirit, in a human being as I understand a human being to be, someone who is transcendent in the sense of going to be here, then you have to ask a different set of questions. So when you instrumentalize people, your questions become instrumental questions. If you begin with reverence for personhood, both with a capital P and a small p, you ask a different set of questions.
So I don't mean this question to be either self-serving or depressing. But where else besides a college like Montreat do those questions get asked and people get formed in the ways that you're describing?
Yeah. So you said college like Montreat. Let's pull that out a little bit. What is it about Montreat that we might find in other places, and but perhaps not as systematically? So it's rare for students to experience the kind of coherence that we just heard about in your honors program, where the faculty work in community, where the learning is integrative, where the learning is rooted in those fundamental questions. That's rare. But it does happen. It happens a little less intentionally. A lot of my work over the years has been with Christian faculty in secular institutions. I knew early in my life as a believer that I was called to the secular world, to work in secular organizations, institutions, and try to bring grace there. And so I've worked with scores and scores of faithful faculty. But the environment they're in is not conducive often. And I think if you read the history of faith in American higher education from someone like, say, George Marsden, then you get a strong sense of how the core of our intellectual tradition, which came to us through faith, has been eroded.
It's easy to think of the roots of what you call the sacred anthropology as coming from Scripture. But there are other sources that you've drawn from as you have developed over a number of years this idea of a sacred anthropology.
Yeah.
What are those other sources?
So, I think probably the beginning of thinking about that came from C.S. Lewis for me, in his amazing sermon, now read as an essay, The Weight of Glory, in which he says, you've never met an ordinary person. No such thing exists. That if you could see a human being, any human being, as they really are, you'd be tempted either to bow in worship or flee in horror, because they're transcendent beings. And all are headed somewhere, either to the vision, as he said it, that is beatific or miserific. And the weight of glory is what we bear. It's the other person's glory whose weight we bear. In every interaction with another human being, we're nudging them to one of those visions or the other. In every system we design, in every performance review system we create, in all those things, in all of our business models. Think of the modern business model. It's sad to me. And this is having worked, as you know, in senior levels in healthcare. There seems to be this idea that if you could just get the right strategy, which is a technical thing, and then align incentives to that technical thing, everyone will behave and do what's best for the strategy. The strategy will succeed, as though human beings were nothing but respondents to incentives, that people worked only for economic gain or whatever. So I think it started for me with Lewis, but there are many other influences, ranging from Dostoevsky, who I mentioned earlier, a wonderful philosopher, modern philosopher at the University of Texas named Paul Woodruff, who wrote a book called Reverence that I thought very well of. Reaching back, a kind of a strange philosopher in many ways, a guy named Josiah Royce, who wrote a book called The Philosophy of Loyalty, where he argued that you know who you really are by what you're loyal to. I thought that was an interesting idea. Walker Percy. Read Lost in the Cosmos. It's a strange little book, but it's all about understanding what it means to be human. So there are lots of resources like that to bring into the conversation, or have been for me. Poets, philosophers, historians, whatever.
You used an example of anthropology as a basis for pedagogy, for teaching. Can you say more about what a sacred anthropology might be for a teacher? We have some teachers in the room and otherwise educators. What does that mean?
Yeah, that's a great question. So 2 or 3 things happened in the middle of the 20th century that made a wreck, really, of education. One was massive growth, and that's really the function of our experience of World War II, which was different from almost any other countries. Our boys came back. No one else's did. 50 million casualties, maybe 60 million, depending on how you count it. America had 300,000. Our boys came back and got busy. And the baby boom occurred about 9 months and 15 minutes later. 18 years after that, they hit college. And we had an explosion of student demand for higher education like we'd never seen before. And America had to respond to this somehow. And you know how it is. If you have a favorite tool, it's the one you pick up first. And America's favorite tool was industrial productivity, the factory. And we remade higher education, not all of it, but most of it in the image of the factory. Big state universities with 1,000-student classrooms. Community colleges where 12% of the people graduate, everybody else is scrap. Bring in the raw material, run them through the process. One person does something, somebody else does something else. If they survive the thing, they're a product at the end. Product. Good gracious. And that just almost destroyed higher education, as we know. Most of us have been fighting, who care about this, have been fighting all our lives, somehow within an institution whose DNA and business model is all tied into industrial production to create humane environments for learning. And where big questions can be asked, and where learning can be integrated, and where faculty function in community, and where the questions come first before the answers, and those sorts of things. So the beginning of that for me has been a conversation with faculty about what they think they know about their learners. Now this is my scientific background, and so I knew a little bit about this. It gave me a little advantage in the conversation, particularly with college faculty, most of whom have strong discipline backgrounds, but not a whole lot in the science of teaching and learning. That was my background. So, and it asked questions like, so how widely is talent available? Is it really rare or is it really common? Can only some people learn some things, or can most people learn most things? What are the conditions under which learning is solidly supported? Where do people thrive as learners? How are they different from one another? How are they the same with one another? What is it about human beings that makes learning? So you can train many animals. That's not what we're after. You can train humans, and there are times when training is important, but that's not an education. So those are anthropological questions. The most important one of which, I think, is this question of who can learn. So for years, I did presentations to people on who learns. And marshaled slide after slide. Do you remember those boring things we called foils, and then we thought turning them into PowerPoints made them more exciting? We used to just death by PowerPoint people on, here's what the science says about learning. And what it says, essentially, is anyone can learn anything under the right conditions. Unless you're damaged, and that's a tiny percentage of people, and even they will surprise you. Mm-hmm. The learners are not defective, and most of higher education believes that there's some small, thin section of people at the top who are competent learners. Everybody else is defective in some way or another. But it's not true.
So let me follow up if I could.
Yeah.
So about 1/3 of United States adults have a 4-year college degree.
Yeah.
That's been true for a very long time. That's been a flat statistic, I think, for at least a couple of decades.
Yes.
Why?
It has nothing to do with the brains of the other 2/3. It has everything to do with the way we've constructed our society. I gave one of those talks, and a woman came up afterwards, Paul, and said, Sandy, I love that talk. Thanks so much. Sign my book, blah, blah, blah. And I think that this thing about anybody can learn anything is true in most disciplines. I said, well, what is it you teach? She said, I teach German. It's a hard language. German's tough.
It's a harsh language.
It's harsh. The words come at the end that change what happened at the beginning, and they just stick words together to make other words. And
they have a word for everything.
They have many words for everything, and they're hard to pronounce without, offending the person you're looking at. All that stuff. And she said that to me. I said, well, she said, after 15 years of teaching German, I can tell you there's some people who just can't learn it. I said, well, how fortunate for them they weren't born in Germany. She looked at me puzzled, and I said, you see, the rate of German literacy in Germany is nearly 100%. Do you think that's genetic? Is there a Deutsche gene?
Don't go there with me. I'm the son of German immigrants, baby.
Yeah, well, it just happens that the conditions for learning German are exceptionally good in Germany.
Right.
It's about conditions. Mm-hmm. So that, for me, was a huge turning point in the life of my last institution, when the faculty wrestled that conversation through and said, you know what? They're not broken. The conditions aren't right. Mm-hmm. Now, that put a big burden on me. I had to figure out how to make it possible for the conditions to be changed in spite of a business model, in spite of a set of policies and a way that financial aid works and all these other systems that are built on the wrong anthropology.
It seems that sacred anthropology is at least a pathway to be considered for evangelism.
Yeah.
Kind of best case scenario, or more, I don't know, more behind the scenes, kind of a sneaky way to talk about evangelism. It's a bridge, as you and I were talking over dinner, this concept of theology discussed as anthropology. So is this a 2022 Western civilization approach to evangelism?
In a way, I would say yes, it is. And let me answer that with two pieces. This morning, my quiet time this morning was Acts chapter 8, I think, or 9, Philip and the Ethiopian eunuch. Okay? So the Holy Spirit just, it was rigged. The whole thing was rigged. The eunuch is reading Isaiah about the suffering servant, and Philip is sent to them, and all Philip has to say to him is, what are you reading? Hey, what have you been reading? The guy says, I'm reading the prophet. And he says, you really? What does it say? And the guy says, I don't know. How will I know if no one tells me? And he says, well, I can tell you. And he unpacks the scriptures. And the guy's baptized right there. And then way before Beam Me Up Scotty, Philip is somehow bounced to the seacoast 60 miles away. An interesting story. Philip started where the eunuch was. In much of Europe, where I do a good bit of particularly evangelistic work, a post-Christian, post-communist, post-postmodern, post-nationalist, post-European, they don't know who they are right now. Right? And my work has been lately very much in Poland, which at least knows it's Catholic, and in Albania, which is the least religious country in the world. When their premier died in 1988, I think it was, there were 17 practicing Christians in a country of 4 million people. There are about 180,000 now. So I go there and speak, and I speak, as I have today, on the edge of the gospel, because that's where they live. They're not asking, who is Jesus? They're asking, does my life have purpose? Should I trust anybody? They're asking those. So I start with those questions. I'll tell you a story about one of those. I was speaking and singing. We had a concert, 400 or 500 students mostly, of various ages, and talking and singing and talking and singing. When we got done, we did just an open Q&A. And about the fourth question, Holy Spirit, this guy stood up and said, "This all sounds kind of religious. What do you believe?" And I thought, well, I can answer that. Even then, I was careful, right? Because these folks have been inoculated. So my comment wasn't, God has a wonderful plan for your life. My comment was, I am as vanilla and ordinary Christian as you could imagine. And I am delighted to tell you that. And if you want to know more about that, I'll be right here on the stage at the end. But for all of you, let me tell you this. I only know two ways of looking at life. One says, look around you. Everyone you see is here temporarily. They're all going to be gone soon. We're mortal. And so what must matter is the legacy you create while you're here. The culture you build, the poetry you write, the fortune you accumulate, the businesses you establish. The legacy must be everything, because we're all temporary. This way of looking at the world is called materialism. And almost all of the broken belief systems in the world have stumbled right at the beginning with that assumption. And the problem with materialism is that you can justify almost any harm to another human being for the sake of some legacy that you treasure. The other way of looking at the universe is to say, look around, everything you see is temporary. The second law of thermodynamics is hard to break. It'll all be gone, everything, except maybe, in some way I can't quite explain in a sentence, that person sitting across the table from you. Every one of you in the room, I would say, has at least entertained the hypothesis that persons last and that the universe at its core is somehow personal. And I would say it is with a capital P. And the gift of personhood, that's the gift of life to humanity, has to be treasured. And you ought to know where it comes from, and you ought to know where it leads.
So this bridge concept, another word that you and I have talked about in the past is translation. So is that part of our task today, is to think about a new vocabulary, an anthropology, but a new language that helps build the bridge?
Yeah, it's easy for us to look on previous generations. Let's go back to, say, the mid-19th century and the image of the English missionary in some primitive culture, and all the embarrassments associated with that kind of lack of sensitivity to cross-cultural environments, the lack of translation. the failure to understand how to communicate with people whose whole world is different from what you experienced. We can make fun of that now. We can critique that now. We're doing it all the time. And we do it with our neighbors. So Christians cannot afford either to let our language die, nor to assume that everyone else must learn ours first. So translation, applying the gospel to the lives of the people around you whom you love, there is no evangelism without that. There is no uninterpreted evangelion.
So for years, decades, you led a large, public, complex, and therefore secular institution. How did your anthropology as a Christian shape the way you led that organization?
Yeah. So that's a great question, and you probably ought to ask the people that worked there.
They're not here. You are.
Here's what I hope. I hope that in every decision we made, we started with what's good for persons. Sometimes it's long-term good, sometimes it's short-term good. And when I'm deeply confused, I just do all the good I can to all the people I can. You all know the quote from Wesley. So I think the core of it was to take the power that's given to us by our positions and say we're going to turn that power not towards protecting institutions in our futures, but towards serving human beings, serving persons, serving our neighbors. And that means human-centered design in the work we do. How does an HR policy honor your personhood or undermine it? What are we telling you in all of our policies and processes in our work? How do we think about the purpose of the institution? How do we measure it? Measurement speaks volumes. And in our case, I think the beginning of that was understanding the students are everything. We're only here for them. That is very hard to remember when they come and go so quickly. And we're here for a long time. So easy to believe in the end it's about us. But keeping them in front of everyone. This is who we're here to serve.
And over the years, was this an evolving understanding that happened inside of you and your team?
I think I came to the institution with a fairly mature idea about this and found kindred spirits. First thing you do, you had a change agenda, and you just can't come in and do that. You have to go find the kindred spirits and make a compact to love this organization to where it needs to be. So I found people there who maybe didn't have the same language as I had, or any at all, but were kindred spirits and made pact with them. But then you begin to have the big conversation. When you want to change an institution's life or culture, it's a 3-step process, very simple. First, you change the conversation. Then you change who's in the conversation. And then you change everything. That's all there is to it. So changing the conversation is where we started.
Yeah. Let's talk for a minute about the local church. We have churches and church leaders in the room tonight. How does this concept of sacred anthropology apply to the local church?
Yeah, so I love the church in all of its forms. I love it like I love my extended family. And there's some out there that are way out on one end of the spectrum and some that are way out on the other and all those in between, and I love them all. I do. But I also want to engage them in a different conversation. And much of the church, particularly the institutional church in the country, has simply absorbed the broken anthropologies of our common culture and operated off of those anthropologies. Theology's fine. Anthropology's all wrong. They've got a sacred theology, a beautiful biblical theology, and they're modeling their business, their institutional life after something else. And mostly it's what we bring with us from our everyday lives, which is an absorbed and broken anthropology that believes the wrong things about human beings.
So what is a church to do? Begin to ask different questions?
Same thing any other institution does. One is be sure that we don't fall into the first trap we set for ourselves, which is to love the thing rather than the thing that the thing points to. So, you end up loving, it's our form of idolatry. All human beings find it easy to move from loving what's worthy of our love to something that symbolizes what's worthy of our love. And to love the wrong thing. So making sure first we're not idolatrous in our worship and in our family life and in our church polity and all those sorts of things. And then secondly, to invite people to a different kind of conversation about how do we do this thing called church? And how is the transcendence of personhood sort of represented here? So when somebody comes in, sometimes it's very simple. Somebody walks into your church and they smell bad. And they have mixed motives, maybe even bad motives. What do you do? Mm-hmm. When they sit next to you? Mm-hmm. Sometimes it's that simple. Mm-hmm. And go back to Lewis again. That person is headed one place or the other. Miserific or beatific. Mm-hmm. How does the church respond to that? So I think just not loving our structures too well, and our habits too well, and our customs too well. You remember when they stoned Stephen in Acts, the accusation against him was that he was teaching, first, that Jesus would destroy the temple, and secondly, that he was undermining the customs that had been handed down to us from Moses. That was his accusation. He did not deny them.
Mm-hmm. You ended your remarks talking about the idea of human transcendence as a beginning point for developing a sacred anthropology. What are the biblical roots for transcendence?
Yeah. So I think my best understanding comes from the bookends. You understand the heights and depths of the personhood God gifted us best in Genesis and in the Revelation. And they're wonderful to read together. And I recommend it. You get the height and the depth of what we can be. It only took a minute for the curse to occur. It only took a minute for the children of the curse to deal with one another. It only took a minute. To understand, I don't like to use words like total depravity, but to understand that the flaw in us is infinitely communicable. Nothing you touch ever will be pure. That's how hard the curse is. That's why we require grace. So, the scriptures, particularly Genesis and Revelation, make it so clear just how base it can be to be a person, but also how glorious and how every knee will bow. The faithful ones and the unfaithful ones, they're all going to bow. Every one, willingly or unwillingly.
Are there any other elements of the sacred anthropology that you've not touched on that you want to surface?
So I would just say that, Paul, that you won't find a lot written around the language of sacred anthropology because most of our theologians have sort of followed the pattern of the creedists and others of the past. And what they've written about is a doctrine of man. Mm-hmm. And that's a different thing. That's about our standing before God. It's the most important subject, but it's a subject. And there's much more that God has given us in our personhood than just that. Mm-hmm. And so it's in the scriptures all over the place about what it means to be human, how creative we can be, how sacrificial. I mean, to this day, there's no answer in science about why a person would make a sacrifice for another person. Mm-hmm. We have no answer for that yet. Mm-hmm. The evolutionists have turned themselves upside down and inside out to give a materialist answer to that, because they do not want to admit on first assumptions that it's possible that we could be more than atoms and cells. Mm-hmm. So understanding our spiritual embodiment, I think the sort of incarnational nature of humanity, but also all the rest of us. Sometimes I think Christians are afraid to appreciate all the gifts God gave us. Every piece of music, every astonishing poem, every moment a grandpa spends with a grandchild, these gifts are extraordinary. They're not all in the Bible, but they're extraordinary gifts, and they certainly are confirmed by God's love in the Bible. So, I think I would argue for people to get their theology right, understand a biblical anthropology, and then grow. Grow your appreciation for what it means to be a person who's going to live forever.
Our time is winding down. You've been associated with this European ministry by the name of Kavadis for a number of years. Can you maybe wrap up this time with an illustration of how you've seen this sacred anthropology play out just give us one illustration.
Okay. I was sharing one with a physician in the audience a little earlier today. I met with a group of heart surgeons. They were pediatric heart surgeons. This was in Poland. I had a partner with me who was a brilliant heart surgeon, and he was demonstrating for them using video techniques now where they can repair the hearts of fetuses whose hearts have just septated. They're 12, 13 weeks old, and they have damaged walls in their hearts, undeveloped walls or valves or whatever. And using transvaginal ultrasound and these tiny instruments, they do heart surgery on babies and save their lives. And at lunch, after he was doing his thing, we had lunch, and I was to go on and talk ethics in the afternoon, where they're having quite a row over lunch in Polish. So I stopped it and said, "What are you guys talking about?" And they said, "You've made us more miserable than we were before." Why is that? Because in this generation, our parents want a perfect child. They don't want a good child. They don't want a healthy child. They want a perfect child. And in this country that once had the lowest abortion rate in Europe, by a large margin, the rate of abortion is skyrocketing because their parents believe they deserve a perfect child. And here's another example where we know a child in the womb who looks like they're not perfect can have a viable life, a life of value. So they got into the argument, and my job at that point was to sort of give them something else to think about. I'm not going to resolve the argument. We had the genetic medicine guys over here saying we'll solve it all with genetics. They were all over the place. So I finally just picked out one of the skeptics, a woman, and said, "I think I heard you had a child." She said, "Yes, I have a daughter." I said, "So how valuable is your daughter?" And she said, "She's very valuable." I said, "Very valuable. How valuable is very valuable?" "Well, she's very, very valuable." I said, "Just very, very." She said, "Okay, she's infinitely valuable." I said, "I so agree. How valuable is your neighbor's child?" Infinitely valuable. How valuable is your neighbor's child with Down syndrome? Infinitely valuable. Can you not have that conversation with the parents? You don't have to believe as I believe. They all knew I was a Christian. And I was speaking. You don't have to believe everything I believe. But can you not have that conversation? And while you're at it, help me understand why you think they're infinitely valuable. I know why I think they are. Why do you think they are?
Thank you. Thanks for a really interesting, thought-provoking address and conversation, and I wish we had more time to do this, but would you join me in thanking Sandy Shugart?
How much would you have loved to have your children or your grandchildren or your friends to sit and listen to this the last hour? How important it is to have a Christian college like Montreat being part of giving a conversation that we don't hear in the rest of our life. Working in secular institutions myself, I am really grateful and envious that my grandchildren would have that experience that you have just laid out for them, for us. So thank you so much. We thank everybody for coming. I'd like to take a few moments to recognize and thank the people who put this together this evening together. As you would be aware, it's very complicated. So take a moment, open your program, look at page 4, and you can take a look at this year's Keystone Scholarship Leadership Donors. I'd also ask for the Keystone leadership donors in the room to please stand and just be recognized. We're really grateful for your support. I love a room full of humble Christians. So for the past 6 years, the Montreat College has hosted this scholarship dinner to help raise critical funds for the Keystone Scholarship Fund. This fund benefits 98% of our students. That is a large number. Athletes, non-athletes, by providing $1.65 million annually in those scholarships. 100% of those gifts go to students, directly to students who desire this Christ-centered education that we've just been talking about. Montreat's college class of 2021 graduated with the second lowest annual student, or second lowest amount of student debt in the state of North Carolina. And this is largely due to the Keystone Scholarship Fund, which significantly lowers tuition costs for students. And wouldn't we love to have it that ultimately Montreat students actually attend college for free? We'd love to have that at some point where no student would ever not go to Montreat because of money. But the donations that you've made have been so valuable. Generous donors have helped us achieve $550,000 for this scholarship fund this evening. By the 30th of June, we would like to have a goal of raising an additional $300,000 for that scholarship fund. If you would like to partner with us in providing these student scholarships, donation information can be seen in your program. So feel free to leave your gift with one of our student ambassadors, which are stationed at the exits of the ballroom. And you can also mail your gift at a later date using the envelope. Finally, a few housekeeping items so that we conclude our evening together. Number 1, make sure you get your parking voucher from one of the student ambassadors as you exit the ballroom. Second thing is the floral arrangements, which are beautiful, in the center of your table can be taken home. Not the vase, but the inside plastic part. Leave the tablecloth there too. And you can just take the plastic container with you. Finally, you can leave your name tags on the table and we'll recycle them. So thank you. I hope you had a great evening. And now we'll just close with a moment of prayer. Lord, thank you for the gift of yourself. Thank you that you define us who we are as persons, and that you have given us the mystery that passes any understanding of human comprehension. We ask that you bless Montreat College, its professors, its leadership, its board of directors, and most of all, its student body. I pray that we will be faithful supporters of the college, that we will care deeply about the students and their education. And we ask you to give us the grace and the energy and the perseverance to make that happen. We ask all these things in the name of Jesus. Amen.